Crafting a good video game story is virtually impossible. Game development as a whole is an ever-changing beast, and even a slight alteration to a level, line of dialogue, or story beat can mean hours of extra work across multiple departments and previously completed code being thrown out. Despite this pressure, though, it's not unheard of for entire stories to get scrapped months before a game is set to ship, and while these cuts sometimes can be disastrous, other times they're actually a blessing in disguise. With that in mind, then I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 8 scrapped endings that almost ruined great video games. Number 8, multiple endings were dropped for one great one, Mafia 2. Mafia 2 is such an underrated game. At the time, it was criticised for not having a bunch of activities to engage with in its open world, but that was never really what the first 2 games were even about. The sandboxes in these titles were always there to drive the story, rather than to give players the freedom to do whatever the hell they wanted, GTA style. However, the developers of the second and best game apparently did envision players having a little more agency than they eventually got, at least when it came to the ending. As written up by Kotaku when building the sequel, the idea was for there to be 4 different potential resolutions depending on the player's actions, potentially even including one where you could save a fan favorite character Joe, who in the main game, spoilers, is surprisingly taken away to be whacked in a final twist. When playtesting was underway though, the devs apparently realized that players were actively seeking out one of these endings, and rather than lumping them with 3 okay finales, they opted instead to axe them all for a single canon one that more fittingly tied up the characters and themes. Though these alternatives could have been cool to see, it's undeniable that Mafia 2's single ending was the correct one to go for. Number 7, Lara Croft murders Amanda in cold blood, Tomb Raider Underworld. Like Mafia 2, Tomb Raider Underworld is tragically overlooked in the gaming world, possibly because it came at the tail end of the franchise's original run, with players feeling that old Lara Croft was outmoded and Nathan Drake was in. A lot of fans just passed it up. It had a pretty solid story though, once again concerning villain Amanda Evert, who ends up embroiled in a plan with fellow longtime series villain Natla. The game followed Lara tracking the duo down while fighting back against a whole bunch of creatures from Norse mythology. It's pretty damn cool, and Croft even wields Mjolnir at one point, which is, yep, just God of War, eat your heart out. All these shenanigans end though when Lara saves the day and actually briefly teams up with Amanda before the pair go their separate ways. But the original scrapped ending featured a final fight between the two that was way darker. After a scuffle in a snowstorm, Lara shoots her nemesis in self-defense and then just leaves her to die as she succumbs to the elements. And yeah, that is extremely cold, both literally and figuratively. It is admittedly in isolation a cool as hell scene, but one that would have felt more at home in Tomb Raider's gritty reboot series rather than this iteration of the character. It's ultimately a much more bleak ending, and actually undercuts the previous development in Amanda and Lara's relationship, so at the last minute it was chopped for something a bit more upbeat. Number 6, Nate vs. Sam was the endgame, Uncharted 4. It's no secret that Uncharted 4 was originally supposed to be markedly different from the game we actually got. When it was announced via that ominous, stunning trailer back in E3 2014, series creator Amy Hennig was still on directing duties. She would part way with Naughty Dog a few months later, leaving it up to The Last of Us's creators Bruce Straley and Neil Druckmann to step in and salvage Nathan Drake's finale. Instead of continuing Hennig's original vision though, the new blood threw out a bunch of work that had already been completed and retooled the story to fit their own interests. As chronicled in Jason Schreier's great book, Blood, Sweat and Pixels, the basics of this story were kept the same. Drake's brother Sam being a major character, a hunt for lost pirate treasure, etc., but everything else was radically different. For one, Sam himself would have been a main antagonist, forcing Drake back into the adventuring business. They would reconcile at the end, but butting heads would have drastically altered the brothers' dynamic. The very ending scene itself was something that was constantly up in the air as well, even after the new directors came on board. Neil Druckmann described the game's initial final scene as being too vague at DICE 2018, ending the series on a shot of Drake, Elena, and their dog after returning from their latest adventure. The director didn't think that was final enough though, and posed the question, quote, "How do we know in a year he doesn't just go back?" Consequently, the new epilogue was created, giving the two a daughter and aging them up to the point where life-threatening trips abroad are firmly in the rearview mirror. Number 5, no post-credit twist, Prey. Prey is one of my personal favourite games of the last generation, but I can understand why the ending is divisive. Throughout the title, you play as Morgan Yu, a scientist battling back against an alien infestation on a space station. However, the final post-credits scene reveals that you're actually one of these aliens, who's been implanted with the experiences of the real you, and subsequently you have relived their battle in an experiment to see if the alien species can learn human ways of thinking. That's because it turns out the aliens have already decimated Earth after escaping the station, and this is the only way of saving humanity. The game then uses the decisions that you made throughout the experience to judge whether or not the experiment was a success, and then cuts to black, leaving the fate of the world hanging in the balance. It's an ambitious ending, but it's jarring to realize that you haven't really been playing as Morgan Yu at all. As written up by comicbook.com, according to the devs, this was actually an idea which came late in development, and the team went constantly back and forth on the separation between the entity you are at the end and the character that you thought you were. Presumably, originally the game would have ended before the post-credits sequence, but while it is divisive, the stinger certainly does a great job of making your decisions matter. Number 4, a whole bunch of different cliffhangers, God of War 3. Back when God of War 3 finished up, it ended the trilogy on something of an ambiguous note. Yes, Kratos had defeated his enemies and an entire mythology, but after being allegedly killed, though when his death kept this guy down before, a post-credit scene teased his disappearance, leaving it up to the audience to figure out what came for the character next. It was a little bit of a sequel tease, showing that he was still out there somewhere, but the game did definitively round out the Greek mythology saga in a satisfying way because, well, by this point, Kratos had killed everyone involved in Greek mythology. However, because each game in the franchise was helmed by a different director, each had their own plans for finishing Kratos' journey. As written up by Cinema Blend, God of War 3's lead man, Stig Asmussen, explored with GamePro the outlines previous developers left him when he boarded the project. He explained that David Jaffe, who helmed the original title, had an idea for the god to continue his murder spree across other mythologies, including Norse, after exhausting every major player in Greece. Cory Barlog, on the other hand, the director of God of War 2, had a slightly different idea, with Asmussen revealing that in his version, Kratos, quote, pretty much becomes the Grim Reaper at the end of the game and his blades become sickles, end quote. Ironically though, Barlog would return to the franchise years later for the God of War reboot and take cues from Jaffe's idea rather than his own. They're both interesting outcomes either way, but because a follow-up wasn't going to happen for years at that point, it was probably for the best that God of War 3 rounded out its trilogy and didn't set anything in stone too much for the future. Number 3, Fighting the Sinister Six, Marvel's Spider-Man. The ending to Marvel's Spider-Man is pretty much perfect. After taking down Dr. Octopus and defeating the Sinister Six, Peter Parker is given a choice that only someone like he could bear the burden of. See, the city is stricken with a disease that's so far incurable, and it's also slowly taking the life of his Aunt May. With one vial of the antidote in his hand, the superhero has to choose to either administer it to the person he loves and doom everyone else, or let May die in order to mass-produce a cure for the city. That finale was always part of the story, but the build-up to it at one point was completely different, with the climax of the game in general being quote-unquote much bigger than in the end product, according to an interview with GameSpot. Initially, chasing down the villains who comprise the Sinister Six was going to take far longer, with each one having their own individual boss battle rather than the team-up boss battles that we ultimately got. This apparently made the game and story drag on for far too long though and messed up the pacing, so it was decided to make this a shorter, more intense burst before the final fight. Though it would have been cool to see NYC in disarray a little bit longer, the quicker resolution is undoubtedly more impactful and stops the superhero romp from stagnating in its final hours. Number 2, Ellie and Joel live happily ever after, The Last of Us. The Last of Us is a game that famously only properly came together during its final months, with so much of the story changing throughout development. In fact, as written up by Eurogamer, the original pitch from Neil Druckmann that Sony greenlit resembled virtually nothing from the finished product. Initially, the idea was to have Tess, who dies very early in the main game, become the villain. Feeling betrayed by Joel, she would propel Joel and Ellie around the country, eventually catching up to them right at the end. Here, the game was going to close out on Joel being tortured by Tess, and then Ellie intervening and killing her. In this version, Tess would have been Ellie's first human kill, but according to Druckmann, quote, "We decided it wasn't going to be about the first time she killed someone, it was more about this coming-of-age story of the impact that the horrors of violence has on her over the course of the game," end quote. Even when this was changed though, the new ending still wasn't good enough. After the hospital scene from the final draft, the epic would have ended on Ellie and Joel moving into a society in San Francisco and helping rebuild civilization, with Ellie buying into Joel's lie. The director, however, described this ending as not being honest enough and altered it to be more ambiguous and, frankly, iconic. Number 1, Otacon and Snake are executed. Metal Gear Solid 4, Guns of the Patriots. Metal Gear Solid 4 is a mad, fun, ridiculous game that bends over backwards to address pretty much every major question the series had posed until that point. Now, the answers might not have always been the most satisfying or sensical, as most of them boiled down to just because nanomachines, but it was all delivered with such confidence and gusto that it's hard to not love it. Primarily because the send-off that it offers for all of the main cast was exactly what fans wanted. Originally though, creator Hideo Kojima had a much less happy ending in mind. The bulk of the game would play out the same, with Solid Snake and Co. taking down the Patriots, but it wouldn't have seen the legendary hero enjoying the remaining years of his life. Instead, the director wanted Snake and Otacon to turn themselves into the authorities, which would have seen them convicted and executed for, saving the world, I guess. As the story goes, the development team pushed back massively against the idea, and that's for the best. Though it's probably the kind of noble atoning for his sins thing that Snake might have done, he'd already suffered enough and sacrificed everything to save a world that was never grateful in the first place, so this final ending was definitely the better one. So that's our list. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. What do you think of these original video game endings, and would you have liked to have seen them included in some form? Let me know, and while you're down there, could you please give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.